I wasn't actually going to say how long ago it was, but it was actually 2008 and 2009. DAT undertook some excavations around the ruins of a small chapel at Portclew at Freshwater East, which is about 4 miles southeast of Pembroke. It was grant-aided by CADU with support from the Pembrokeshire Coast National Park and was intended to obtain evidence to inform possible scheduling as part of the Pembrokeshire Cemeteries project. I do not like this microphone. Can you still hear me? Yeah, no. So today I'm going to describe the site and the results of the investigation and then consider the evidence in the light of a recent reinterpretation of similar sites elsewhere in Wales. Sorry, I should have shown you that slide at the beginning. That's just situating the chapel. As you can see, it's just to the southeast of Pembroke there on the coast above Freshwater East. There is actually very little documentary evidence relating to the early history of Portclew. The only known reference is in a mention of a settlement at a place called Portclew, which appears in the Black Book of St David's written in 1326. And at that time, Portclew was part of the manor of Lamphy, and rents from the tenants of Portclew form a large part of the total returns from Lamphy, which suggests that there was a larger population at that time than we perhaps might assume. And this is the remains of the chapel. It measures about 8.5 metres east-west by about 4 metres north-south. But as you can see, the east gable wall still survives sort of virtually intact, and that's standing to about 5 metres. We don't know the dedication of the chapel, and we don't know the dedication of this, it's probably a holy well, which is in the opposite corner of the chapel field, close to a trackway of presumed medieval origin. The chapel is not mentioned in the Taxatio Ecclesiastica of 1291, which was a document that listed all the parish churches in England and Wales for taxation purposes, but it has been suggested, despite that, that the structure dates from the 13th century based on the character of this window. So in 1964, during the construction of a house near the chapel, human remains were discovered, and in 2000 a cable trench was cut in the neighbouring field, and that revealed 16 burials, 5 of which were in stone-lined kist graves like this, and this is the top of a kist there. That's the slab stones at the top. You might have seen, or maybe you didn't see some of those in the St Patrick's Chapel talk. So 5 of those were in stone-lined kist graves, and this suggests that the chapel and the burial ground probably have an early medieval origin, because the vast majority of dated examples of kist graves are pre-Norman conquest in Wales. So to identify target areas for the excavation, we undertook a geophysical survey in 2008, and this is the results. It allowed us to target the locations for the trenches. I'm going to have to come across and point. So burials are not apparent on the survey, but it did pick up these big curving ditches and what seems to be a rectangular ditch quite close to the chapel, in fact enclosing the chapel. The largest of those enclosures seemed to be about 50 metres in diameter. The stripes that you can see, the banding here, that's the natural geology. It's bands of vertically bedded red and green sandstone. So the trenches were located to sample the enclosure ditches and the interior of the enclosure, to explore aspects of the chapel and to determine the extent of the cemetery. So this is trench 1. It was positioned in order to target all 3 of the ditches that showed up on the survey. It's the location of it there. So that end down there is at the top of the screen there. And we've got radiocarbon dates for these ditches now, so I can talk about them in chronological order. And the earliest one was the little rectilinear ditch. Radiocarbon date from charcoal in the lowest fill of that ditch is mid-6th to mid-7th century AD. And the ditch had, along its northernmost edge, had a series of pits just cut into it, and charcoal from the lowest fill of one of those has given a date of almost identical date. So it gives us a sort of mid-6th, 7th century date for the earliest cut features there. The next ditch, the innermost curvilinear ditch, we had radiocarbon date again from charcoal in the very lowest fill. So this is when the ditch is silting up, of mid-7th to late 9th century AD. Just check that I haven't forgotten to tell you anything. I'll come back to that in a second. And the outermost ditch, slightly later again, this one date from the middle fill of early 9th to early 11th century AD. The environmental evidence shows that barley was being grown in large quantities. The fill of the rectilinear ditch contained large quantities of barley. But also, so that was the main cereal crop, but bread, wheat and oats were also being grown along with broad beans. The other two ditches, they showed that barley continued to be grown, and they were slightly richer in wheat and oats, but this wasn't from the lowest fill, and it is possible that that's intrusive evidence from later on in the period. There were red shale fragments in the outermost ditch with pick marks on them, and they could be evidence of a bank that has weathered into the ditch, or they could be just eroding in from the sides of the ditch when it was open. We didn't find any evidence for a bank, but the presence of post holes in between these two ditches suggests that if there was a bank, it was probably external to the outermost ditch, because you wouldn't really have the post holes under the bank. There were post holes also found down the far end of the trench in the interior of the enclosure, but without any stratigraphic relationships and with no dating evidence from them, it's not possible to assign those to specific phases at the site. There was also a varied assemblage of domestic pottery dominated by sherds of 12th to 13th century date, and that was found in the upper fills of all three of the ditches. So along with the evidence for post holes in the backfill of ditches and this remnant of walling just there, which is clearly later than other features in that trench, that it's sort of suggesting activity on the site continuing into the post-conquest period. But except for a shallow scoop in Trench 1 there with a few teeth in it that probably represents an infant burial, there were no burials in Trench 1. However, in Trenches 2, 3 and 4 in the first season and in Trench 8 in the second season of excavation, 33 burials or probable burials and a quantity of disarticulated human bone were found. So 12 of those were excavated to this level and photographed, and 6 then were actually lifted for analysis. The graves were all oriented east-west with the head to the west. Some of them were marked with head and foot stones, and there was evidence for management of the burial ground because there were rows of graves in some places, although in others, as you can see, there was intercutting, so perhaps that management sort of slipped up from time to time, I'm not sure. And there were a variety of grave forms, as you can see. There's a grave top left with slab covers on top of it. Then this one had slab stones on the base. Some had just the slabs around the sides, on the sides and the ends. And this person here, whose grave has disturbed an earlier kissed grave, they didn't have any stones around their burial at all. And this is typical of burial practices during the early medieval period in Wales and also in Ireland, Scotland and southwestern England. And the radiocarbon dates for the 6 burials that we lifted span the late 5th to the early 10th centuries AD. So analysis of the human remains by Katie Humer, who was then at Sheffield, has revealed that 4 of the burials lifted were those of adults, 3 males and 1 female, and 2 were of children aged 7 to 12 years and 13 to 18 years. And in addition, the remains of a 1 to 6-year-old child and a 0 to 8-week-old infant were found during the post-excavation, and those were both among the bones of male adults. Katie's research has also shown that several of the individuals in the cemetery were not local to the area. Skeleton 1, an adult male, grew up in a western coastal location, either in Cornwall, Western Ireland or the Outer Hebrides. Skeletons 4 and 5, a 13 to 18-year-old and a female adult, grew up in a non-coastal location in either mid or northwest Wales. And skeleton 2, a 5 to 7-year-old, grew up in a much warmer climate. When their teeth were forming, they lived in a much warmer climate, probably the Mediterranean. And you can see the dates that we've had for those burials there. And this is a similar picture that we're getting from other early medieval cemeteries in Wales, Brownslade Barrow, West Angle Bay, St Patrick's Chapel. It's all giving us a picture of the mobility of people during this period. And we also had further evidence for the mobility of people and also objects during the period from Trench 8 in the neighbouring field, where the fill of a small pit that had been truncated by the 7th to 9th century curving ditch contained this sherd of pottery, which was subsequently identified as the base of a rare type of 6th to 7th century ceramic beaker from western France. Pottery and glass originating in France, the Mediterranean and North Africa is occasionally found on high status 5th to 7th century sites in Wales, with the main distribution occurring adjacent to the Severn and its estuary in Wales. And it's indicative of continuing links with the continent during the immediate post-Roman period. So most of the evidence that we've seen so far was from the first season of excavation, but as you've seen, there were hints of later activity, the remnants of stone walls, later pottery, and this suggested that there was more going on at the site than we'd seen so far. So in 2009, this was further explored by targeting other geophysical anomalies seen on the survey, and this revealed the remains of 3 small buildings. Building A was represented by a group of cut features and layers of dark humic material containing occupation debris. So the structural evidence points to a wooden building, probably wattle and daub, and it was about 4.5 metres wide. And you can see here there was a drip gully around the edge where water's dripped off the roof, and then there is a sunken floor which comes, this is the edge of the sunken floor coming around, sorry, it comes right out there. And there are post holes either end of a beam slot, creating some sort of internal division. And again, there seems to be perhaps later another beam slot running through and some more post holes. So we had sherds of late 12th to 13th century cooking pots of Bristol pottery, Ham green ware and Dyfed gravel tempered ware recovered from this building, and also sherds of a fine micaceous ware green glazed jug. And the charred bread wheat from a trampled yard area outside the building has been radiocarbon dated to the early 11th to the early 13th century, which is consistent with the pottery evidence. And then we have building B, which was of dry stone construction, probably with timber posts supporting a roof, timber posts on the wall base that supported a roof, and as you can see, surviving as a low wall which stood to about 7 courses in places. And this is about 11 by 4 metres in its dimensions. A floor level had been cut into the bedrock, truncating earlier graves. And so what you've got here is, this is the backfilled ditch just there, and back just here. This is the backfilled earlier ditches. So they deliberately backfilled them, I think, to construct, to cut the floor and then construct this building on top. There is a hearth here, and there's another one up there. And these flat stones, we think, were where people stood a pot, been either by the fire to heat the contents of the pot, or if the pot had been on the fire, that they took it off and they stood it on the pot stand there. So the first hearth that I showed, just behind it in the wall, there was this huge back stone, which I imagine would have reflected out some considerable heat. And then this hole, which seemed to be intentionally left in the wall for some sort of ventilation, whether it was to let smoke out or whether to let air in, or perhaps it functioned in both ways. I'm not sure. And then up here, the construction of the wall changed, and this was interpreted as a blocked-in doorway. So again, grains of charred bread wheat from the hearth have given a mid-11th to mid-13th century date, again consistent with the pottery recovered, which was 12th to 13th century ham green and Dyfed gravel tempered ware cooking pots, and some jugs, and also 3 sherds of glazed ridge tile. So Many of the features and the deposits within Building A, and all of those in Building B, were found below a deposit of wind-blown sand. The archaeological evidence for Building C comprised a possible beam slot, just here, and 3 post holes. There was no formal floor apparent, but there was a deposit of dark humic material similar to that was seen in Building A. There was no datable material recovered from it, but it was clearly later than the backfilled curving ditches and a number of burials which it had truncated. So from all these 3 buildings, we've had fragments of animal bone, mostly cattle and sheep or goat, but also some pig, horse and domestic fowl represented. And along with the bread wheat, they were growing oats, peas, broad beans, and they were also eating hazelnuts, elderberries, crab apples, wild radish, and the main cereal, large amounts of barley again. And together with the animal raise, this is typical of a rural agricultural community that's supplementing the diet with wild foods. The assemblage of shellfish was dominated by limpets, which are not nice to eat, so I'm told. But they were possibly being used as fish bait. Very few fish bones were recovered. There were a few, but their structure and their chemistry makes them less likely to survive than mammal bones will, or bird bones will. So in terms of thinking about parallels for these structures, stone buildings with rounded external corners, medieval date, have been recorded at several sites in northwest Wales, although they do tend to have squared internal angles, and Building B has rounded internal angles as well. But similarly, a large round-cornered structure was excavated at Rossilly in West Glamorgan, and that's thought to be of early 12th century date. And hot off the press, because we were actually digging this yesterday, just north of the A40 between Whitland and Haverfordwest, we are currently excavating a structure that's very, very similar to Building A that we've just seen. So we've got a drip gully, comes round the outside. This is before the end of the day when we'd actually finished cleaning this, so you'll have to take my word for it. But there is a drip gully that comes around this building. There is a sunken floor, and there is a beam slot that runs across there. There's a post hole about under Tom's foot there. There's another post hole, hasn't come up yet, it's in that corner. Once this sticky mud was taken off, there's a post hole there. And there's a sherd of what looks like is going to be a sort of cooking pot in the gully there, and just out of shot here, as if someone had just dropped a pot on the ground and it's broken and they've left it there. It's quite amazing, and I need to say thank you to Luke for letting me have that slide at 6:30 this morning. Yeah, I'm sure he'll thank me later. Finally then, going back to the Portclew excavation, on either side of the chapel wall we had a trench to try and look at the stratigraphic relationships, and inside the building it showed that the floor had been robbed out at some time in the past, and outside there was evidence for a foundation cut. There was, across the top of all of this, there was either construction or demolition debris sealing the whole lot and sealing that burial, so showing again that it's later than the burials. So that's all the evidence. So what does it all mean? So just a quick recap. We've got curvilinear ditches, 2 of them, rectangular ditch, which is the earliest cut feature on the site, later chapel, we think, and a series of later buildings. These are drawn in. Some of them, that's, where are we? I think that's Building A, Buildings B and C there, or possibly there. And the extent of the cemetery should come up here a bit further, because we had graves in Trench 8 as well. So the probable rubbish pits and the charred cereal and other plant remains that were found in the ditches are indicative of settlement, and the sherd of Eware suggests that this was of a high status secular or ecclesiastical community of the 6th to 7th centuries, and the radiocarbon dates show that this settlement was contemporary with the earliest burials. We can't rule out the existence of an earlier, probably timber church, because the site has been heavily disturbed by the later buildings and has not been fully excavated, so there could still be evidence for a timber church there. But the balance of probability, I think, suggests that it wasn't an ecclesiastical site. There is a total lack of documentary evidence for an important early site here, and if it has e-ware and it's high status, then it's important, and most of the important early medieval church sites we still know about, we know where they were. And there's also no evidence for the type of circular embanked churchyard enclosure that's typical of Welsh churches that have an early medieval origin. So if this was a secular settlement, then in its 6th to 7th century phase, Portclew might be a type of site that's recently been identified in Ireland, where then it's known as a cemetery settlement, and in Wales as a multifunctional cemetery. And the characteristics of these sites are that they have one or more enclosures, they have burials, they have evidence for metalworking and or crop processing, and they have no contemporary church. So burial can predate the settlement evidence, or it can be contemporary with the settlement, or it can post-date the settlement. But the key thing is that at these sites, burial and settlement activity took place in the same location. And this is a massive departure from the Roman period, when there was actually a law prohibiting burial within the settlement. You buried your dead outside the settlement, outside the town, outside the walls. So just looking at these sites, Capel Mylog in Powys, I think it's not an exact parallel, but I think it's a close parallel to Portclew, because there you have, with the eye of faith, almost rectilinear, perhaps, ditch, which was one of the earliest dated features on the site. That's given a 290 to 610 AD radiocarbon date, and then you have 8th to 11th century charcoal underneath this bank. Oh, and they also have what look like early roundhouse drip gullies in that corner, so suggestions of settlement. And then you have the very earliest phase of burial, and burial on this site continued. There was a church built, and burial continued into the 16th century all around this area. But and looking at the graves and the level of bone survival, it was suggested that these very early graves, which are dated to the late 8th to mid-11th century, had been open to the elements for some time before the church was built. The level of poor bone preservation suggested that they hadn't had a structure over them protecting them, although they were under the church that was subsequently built. This ditch and this ditch were backfilled in order to put that structure on top. So looking, settlement evidence, burial evidence, later church, some enclosures. And so that site potentially in use perhaps from the 5th to the 16th century AD. Portclew possibly in continuous use between the 6th century and around the mid-14th century. The pottery expert who looked at all the potsherds was pretty certain that the site had gone out of use by the mid-14th century. So we have to think then about why did it go out of use? That we found no evidence for a fire. There's no evidence that the buildings burned down. It's possible that there was a sand inundation, whereas there was sand burying both the buildings, but all the features on the buildings were below wind-blown sand. And there's a documented episode of this dating from the 14th century. On the 6th of December 1330, just what you want for Christmas, 11 cottages and 28 acres of land at Rossier on Anglesey were overwhelmed by sea and sand. And then closer to home, sand inundation in either the 15th or the 16th century probably caused the abandonment of a small medieval settlement at St Ishmael's, just between Kidwelly and Ferryside. But there could also be other reasons. We know that in 1326, when the Black Book of St David's was compiled, the settlement still survived, so that suggests that it did survive the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. But between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed 40 to 60% of the population of Europe. And it's estimated that in 1349, when we know that Pembroke was badly hit, the plague reduced the population of Wales by 1/4. So I think we have to consider perhaps a combination of sand inundation and the Black Death, and people, you know, just abandoned the settlement at Portclew. Whether they were all dead or whether they moved somewhere else, I don't know, but I think that's my feeling as to why it was abandoned. Okay, thank you.